So let's get started. We now move away from secondary sources, or what, as you know, I like to call stuff to help you find the law, and we move to the law. Basically, the law is established by the various branches of government. And where we are going to start is with the Sources of the Law handout. This handout is also on the course website. We are now moving in our modules from secondary, as I said, to statutes. And we will you'll basically find everything we're talking about today in the statutes module. So looking at Sources of the Law, actually is also on the web here. There's a lot going on in this chart, so I'm gonna do my best to explain it to you. But if you can understand the organization and what it's trying to tell you, you are probably 50% the way there to understanding the resources available when researching primary law. So looking at the chart, as you can see, the first column is basically the description of what's going on in columns 2 and 3. Column 2 is just federal stuff, and column 3 is New York State and municipal stuff. That's the easy part. A little more, requiring a little closer reading are the rows. So the first row is going to be what establishes the structure of the government. And of course, in federal realm, that's U.S. Constitution. And in the state, you've got state constitutions. Here in New York, of course, New York. And on the municipal, the local level, the charter, we'll talk about state and local stuff in the next few classes and later on in the semester. Then moving down, the next 3 major rows are going to be essentially the 3 branches of government. On the federal end, as established by the U.S. Constitution. So we've got Article 1, the legislative branch, and of course that's going to be Congress, the House and the Senate. Then the next major row down, the executive branch, of course it's going to be the president as well as the executive agencies under the executive branch. You may remember in the news in the last few weeks has been the government shutdown. What they were talking about were mostly these agencies. And then of course Article 3, possibly your favorite, we all know and love, the judicial branch, and of course there we're talking about judges' opinions in case law. Any questions? Okay, basic civics, but want us all to start here on the same page. Okay, so we are going to be going over these 3 branches pretty much now through beyond spring break. So as I said, if you can understand this chart, you're a long way there to understanding what we need to know. I am going to start today with the legislative branch, so that first sort of major row there after the Constitution. And we are going to focus today on the federal, on that middle box, the left and middle box under the legislative branch. Okay, so as you may remember from our screencast, we have our hero, the law, and our hero became the law because the president signed the bill, and once the president signs the bill, it comes into law. Essentially, as I suggested in our screencast, we are starting in the middle of the story. Once we have a law, we will talk about the beginning of the story, or the prequel, when we talk about legislative history, and we'll talk a little bit about what happens later on in the story next time when we talk about tracking new developments in legislation. So here we have our hero, the public law. And as we can see, looking at our sources handout, going back there, we have a session law that's enacted by the legislature. So we're focusing on federal now, so we're focusing on Congress. So a piece of legislation that's passed by both houses of Congress and then is sent to the president, and the president signs it, that becomes the law. That is called a session law, sometimes also referred to as a slip law. That's because in the old days, before the web, They used to get published in a little booklet like this that looked kind of very slip-like, and so they were referred to as slip laws. I mention that because people still make that reference, and you still see that reference here and there. Okay. So let's go. So essentially, a session law is just a generic name for a law that's passed by the legislature, signed by the executive. As you go across into that middle box on our chart, you see that in the federal world, that session law is called a public law. And so our hero's name, essentially, generally is public law. And that's important to know, again, because you will see that reference a lot. So essentially, when we're talking about statutes, we're talking about, and I'm going to try to keep my terminology straight here because it's easy to get confused, we're basically talking about either session laws, again, passed by the legislature, signed by the executive, or statutes appear in codes, and we'll be talking about codes at length in just a little while. So now we're still looking at the public law, again, as it was passed by the legislature, signed by the president. And as you can see on our sources handout, that public law, our hero, PL, appears in two places, or as I suggested in the screencast, on two planets. In STAT, which is just the abbreviation for statutes at large. You'll see the abbreviations below in that tiny print below the chart. As well as USCAN. So let's take a closer look at this, at our hero, get to know our hero a little bit better, and take a closer look at a public law. And for that, I provided you with your two other handouts. So we have the story of our public law. I like to tell things. Fun to tell things in stories, and then the thicker handout are just sample pages, and we'll be going through all of them, and I'll be explaining them as we go. The sample pages are really just a way for you to be able to see what we're talking about a little bit more clearly, because sometimes the screen is a little hard to see. Okay, but the story is really what you want to focus on and be able to understand. So again, we have our public law, and of course, there are any number of public laws that get enacted, passed by Congress, signed by the President. And the way our public laws are referenced are basically first by Congress. So a Congress basically is just a numbering system for the years that Congress sits, starting from the very first one. So the first Congress started, it's not surprisingly, in 1789. A Congress lasts 2 years because, of course, the House of Representatives, each representatives is elected for 2 years. So, of course, we just had an election back in the end of 2018. So we're starting with a new Congress in January, and that new Congress is the 116th Congress, which, as you can see, started in 2019 and will last through 2020. So what we have here is a listing of the public laws that have been enacted, again, signed into law by the President for the 116th Congress, for this very new Congress that just started in January. And there have been all of 5 of them so far, at least as reported on this website. And basically, the public law number consists of the Congress numbers, so 116, we're in the 116th Congress, and it just starts with the first one and gets numbered sequentially through the 2 years that a Congress lasts. So you can get a better sense of it. Let's take a quick look at the 115th Congress. That lasted 2017 to 2018. And you'll see the most recent one was the last one in the 115th Congress at the end of 2018 was Public Law 115-442. Of course, the very first public law back in the 115th Congress back in 2017, probably January, was 115-1. So hopefully you get a sense now of what that public law number does and means, because that's essentially how that's our hero's name, public law, whatever his or her public law number is. So we are going to talk a little bit about a public law in the 93rd Congress, and looking at our chart here of Congresses, we know that the 93rd Congress took place in 1973 through 1974. So I'm just setting you in, setting our story in the proper time period. Okay, so let's get to know a particular public law a little bit better. And for that, we're going to turn to the walkthrough handouts, the sample pages. And again, stop me if you have any questions. I know a bunch of you had some really great questions in the screencast. I am hoping that what we go through today will answer them. If they do not, then please, by all means, chime in with your questions. Okay, so we are going to look at Public Law 93-406. That is actually our hero in question. And our hero, 93-406, the 93rd Congress, again, public laws, the official place they live in is the Statutes at Large, abbreviated STAT. So we are looking at the first page, volume 88 of Statutes at Large. And since our hero is 93-406, we can see in the second handy-dandy arrow, public laws 93-246, our public law number falls right in the middle of that range listed there. And just because it's maybe a picture is worth more than 1,000 words, here is where our hero lives. Here's the Planet Statutes at Large, volume 88. I don't know if you guys are into show and tell, but if you are, pass it around and take a look. Get some weightlifting in there, if nothing else. Okay, so that's the title page of the whole volume 88. Let's look at our hero, Public Law 93-406. Turn the page, and we can also bring our hero up on the screen. We are looking at essentially the same thing. So again, so you can get to know our hero really well. What we are looking at is volume 88, so you see that little number 1. That's the first part of our citation. You should be used to citations by now, I imagine. Number, abbreviation, number, so volume, abbreviation, page. So 88 stat, and then on the right-hand side, for whatever reason, it separates it on two sides of the page. Don't know why. The second part of our citation. So our hero starts on page 829 of volume 88 of Statutes at Large, and we see our hero's name, Public Law 93-406. Statutes at Large, as I mentioned in this screencast, is chronologically arranged. What that means is that what appears in that particular volume is not organized in any way other than just what came next chronologically. That's what I mean by chronologically arranged. So I'm here at a website called GovInfo. We'll be talking about it quite a lot later on. And here are the different volumes of Statutes at Large, going backwards chronologically. So the latest it has is from 2011. You can see it's volume 125. So all I did is scroll down to volume 88, which again is where our public law lives, volume 88 of Statutes at Large. And then I found, again, because it's numerically 88, and we know it's 88-229, just checked it out, and scrolling down, we see, if I can get there.
I think you mean
829, yeah, I've got my numbers transposed. We'll get there. Ta-da, there we are, 88 Stat 829 Employee Benefit Security Act. And the whole reason I went through this whole exercise is just to demonstrate to you that it's organized chronologically, so we can just see the dates each one was added. They have nothing to do with one another. So right before Employee Benefit Security Act was the District of Columbia Appropriation Act, topically not remotely related. And right after that, something else about the District of Columbia, Public Higher Education Reorganization Act. Again, not remotely related topically, just organized chronologically. So that was the point I wanted to make. Okay, so that's how Statutes at Large is organized. Let's take a look now back at our hero, Public Law 93-406 in Statutes at Large. And we see that it's telling us a couple of things. It's actually telling us right there at the top where to find in the U.S. Code, and it's referring us to 29 U.S.C. 1001. The U.S. Code, that first number is sometimes referred to as title. So Title 29 U.S. Code 1001. I see a couple of you nodding along. That sounds familiar to some of you anyway. So that's a useful piece of information we'll be coming back to quite a lot. Moving down a little bit, you see another handy-dandy arrow where I highlight the subject area of the Act. So Title I. So there is another use of that word title in a different context. The word title can get confusing because it's used in different ways. It's used to talk about titles of the U.S. Code or other codes. It's also used to talk about titles of session laws, of public laws. When it's used to talk, the word title generally is used to mean the idea of subject area. It could be subject area of the U.S. Code. It could be subject area of a particular act. So Title I of our hero, Public Law 93-406, is just the subject area that covers protection of employee benefits rights. And I'm just reading right next to Title I. So again, that's just subject area. And the subject area of Title I, the first title of our act, talks about employee benefits rights. And the first thing we get is that ever useful table of contents. And if you thought I was crazy about table of contents for secondary sources, I'm going to be even crazier about table of contents for statutory codes. Because frequently you will get a reference to a statutory code that's not the greatest section, but if you look at the table of contents, you will find a great section. Or you will find other useful and necessary sections. So for example, I see Section 3 definitions. I'm going to talk about definitions, and I'm always going to want to make sure to look at definition sections. Okay, so we just see the different sections listed here. If we turn our page, we see more sections, and I have highlighted for you with a handy-dandy arrow, Section 514. We will be coming back to Section 514. Then after that, we see the next subject area or title of Public Law 93-406. Our hero, we see Title II, and that's Amendments to the Internal Revenue Code. So the Internal Revenue Code is going to appear in a different subject area of the U.S. Code. Does anybody know which title number that is? Any tax junkies here? We'll see shortly. So again, the point here being 93-406 covers different subject areas, and those subject areas are called titles. Any questions? Okay, continuing on, let's go to page 3. More tables of contents. I skipped ahead a few pages so as not to kill too many trees, and so I've come to the end of the table of contents, and now at long last we get to the actual text of Public Law 93-406, the text of our statute. And so we see Section 2 is Findings and Declaration of Policy, and again, Statutes at Large is very nice to us. It tells us that we can find Section 2 in 29 U.S.C. 1001. Make a note, because again, this is very important. This section in the U.S. Code 1001, that number is not remotely the same as Section 2. Right? We all can agree on that? Okay, believe it or not, that's really important. It's a statement of the obvious. It's also really important. Let's turn to page 5 of the walkthrough. And here, as I mentioned, I've highlighted definitions. As it says right here, always good to check the definition sections. I'm going to say very ungrammatically that law is words, right? Law is made up of words. You need to know how those words are defined. So if you are looking at a statute and that term, that word is statutorily defined, you need to know that. And frequently, those terms are statutorily defined in definition sections. So if you see a definition sections, look at it. It may not have your particular term. It may not always be helpful, but it's worth spending a few minutes to look at any definition sections that are in your statutory code context. Okay, and notice too also that our definition section, Statutes at Large, is telling us is in 29 U.S.C. 1002. But notice that in our public law, 93-406, it's labeled Section 3. So again, the number 3 is not the same as 1002. Let's turn the page to page 6. And again, I've skipped ahead and I mentioned that we will be interested in Section 514 of our HERO Public Law 93-406. Anybody recognize the reference on the right, 29 U.S.C. 1144? Can anybody remind us where we've seen that? In our secondary materials, and a number of the different secondary sources referred us to where our section, our code section, 29 U.S.C. 1144, turns out to be the section about ERISA preemption. And now we have seen that our section 1144 actually was enacted by section 514 of our HERO Public Law 93-406. Any questions about that? Okie dokie. Moving ahead, getting to know our HERO, turning to page 7. We're now looking at Title 2, or Subject Area 2, again, amendments to the Internal Revenue Code. And this is where we find out that Section 1011 of our HERO, Section 1011 of 93-406, basically makes additions to the Internal Revenue Code, and in that wonderful little side note, the Statutes of Large tells us that it's actually in Title 26 of the U.S. Code. So if there were any tax junkies in the room, you would have known that the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code, is Title 26 of the U.S. Code. Don't worry, you don't need to know that for this class. I'm just pointing out the difference of the different subject areas of where different parts of Public Law 93-406 wind up. So Title 1 wound up in Title 29. Title 2 is winding up in Title 26. Any questions? And again, I'm not asking you to memorize this particular public law, just understand that parts of public laws get divided up into different titles of the U.S. Code. That's the bottom line here. Okay, if everybody is good with that bottom line, let's turn to page 8. And here we see the other planet, going back to our screencast, where we will find our HERO 93-406. And that is in United States Code Congressional and Administrative News. I certainly don't expect you to remember that full name. I'm probably not going to say it again because it's too much of a mouthful. We just refer to it as USCAN. And you will see it cited as USCAN. And the reason I even mention it is that judges and other references, other sources still refer and cite to USCAN, and that's what USCAN is. USCAN, among other things, it does other things that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, but for now, USCAN is just another place where you will find public laws, another planet, if you will. USCAN is unofficial, Statutes at Large is official, for blue booking purposes, for those of you who worry about that. The only other thing worth noting, really, about USCAN for now, and here it is, I'll do another show and tell for those of you who are interested, is it's just numbered differently. So you find USCAN by year, and then each year it starts over with volume 1. So unlike Statutes at Large, where you can find your public law immediately with the volume number, with USCAN you have to know the year, and then you can find your public law. And so you can hopefully get convinced that Statutes at Large pretty much does the same thing for public laws, or rather USCAN does the same thing as Statutes at Large for public laws. And turning to page 9, the number got cut off, but you can see it is the beginning of our HERO Public Law 93-406. And it continues on page 10. Basically, it all looks the same. Turning to page 11, Shows us those findings and declaration of policy. We will be looking at this when we talk about legislative history. Turning to page 12. Again, we see that section 514. Anyone remember where we will find that in the U.S. Code?
1144.
1144, Title 29, exactly. Now notice USCAN doesn't tell us that, so unfortunately not as useful in that regard. Okay, any questions so far? So we're going to try something a little new today and do a sort of mini group workshop. And I'm going to use something some of you probably have used before if you had Professor Gundlach for civil procedure, called Poll Everywhere. You can pull out and do it on your phones. You might want to do it on your laptop because I'm going to ask you to go to websites. Whichever you like better is totally good with me. So for those of you who don't have it on your phones or just prefer to be on your laptop, in the modules, let me go to, so on the course website, in modules under statutes, you will see a link to Poll Everywhere. And actually, let me go back and make this poll active. And, okay. So if all goes well, you should now see this. I'm going to do a quick check. Yep, you should see this by everything I can tell, and that's the one we want. Okay, so I'm going to go ask you to answer this poll. The generic name for a public law is session law, true or false? So again, go to the Poll Everywhere link. You should see it on your laptop or your phone. Give me a wave when you're done. Tell those of you who had Professor Gundlach, because you're familiar with this. I'll give the rest of you a little bit more time. You're having trouble? So again, the link in the statute module should get you there. If it's asking you to log in, you don't have to. So go back up. Statute, Poll Everywhere. Okay, and if it asks you don't have to log in, there you go. Good. Looks like it's working. Anybody else? Hey, we're already getting results. Cool. Okay, so the vast majority answered true, and that is absolutely correct. So again, the word session law is just a generic term for a law passed by a legislature, any legislature. Could be federal, could be state, and then signed by the executive. So we're talking about federal today, so a law passed by Congress, signed by the president, is a session law, and in the federal world, it's known as a public law. Different states have different names for it. We'll talk about that next week. So for the 31% of you who weren't too sure about that, any questions, don't be shy. That's why we do the workshops. Better you ask now than get confused later. Any questions? Okay, if not, let's go to our next poll. Public Law 111-148 was passed in which Congress? So remember, the public law numbers each mean something. And remember, Congresses are numbered. Giving away the answer here. Anybody need more time? Okay, so let's show results. Again, the majority has it. Okay, So Public Law 111-148 was passed in the 111th Congress. So again, a public law, the first number tells us what Congress. Again, Congress lasts for 2 years, and the first Congress goes back to 1789, and we're now in the 116th Congress, which just started last month. And 148 just means it was the 148th public law passed in the 111th Congress. Does that make sense? Again, please ask now. Not that you can't ask later. You can always ask, but the sooner you understand it, I think the better off you'll be. Okay, one more for now. Okay, the best description of the statutes at large is. Now read this one carefully. It's not really a trick question because I'm keeping my promise. I won't do quick trick questions, but you're lawyers. You gotta read carefully. Didn't think I'd be wishing for the polar vortex, but right now, a little blast of cold air would be good. Okay, anybody need more time? Let's check out our results. Excellent. Again, good sizable majority. The official source for public laws, organized chronologically. If you went by subject, fair enough, it's easy to get confused. Remember, we were looking at that long list at one of the websites, and Public Law 93-406 was right after stuff about DC education and right before DC something or other. I don't even remember what. Doesn't matter. So again, public laws are in statutes at large, and that's organized chronologically. Any questions? Okay, let's go back. So we now get to the good part. Well, one of the good parts. And remember, in our screencast, we talked about the application of the force. And what that was, as I tried to explain in the screencast, was codification, the transferring of the statute, the text in the public law, to the code. Why is that so amazing? Why is that the application of the force? Well, if you turn to page 13, we've already discussed one of the main reasons. And that's because, face it, when we're doing research, we're not looking for Public Law 93-406. We don't magically have these numbers. We're looking for laws. When we're doing statutory research, we're looking for statutes on a particular subject, right? So the code, in this case, the federal case, the United States Code, organizes all of the laws by subject area. And as I mentioned, the U.S. Code calls those subject areas titles. Again, that word titles used in a couple of different ways. And as we see on page 13, Title 29, as we've been noticing that reference, is the labor title. Not surprisingly, since we're talking about employee benefits, Employee Retirement Income Security Act. I already mentioned to you earlier, Title 26 happens to be the Internal Revenue Code. Title 18, Crimes and Criminal Procedure. I'm obviously not going to read them all. You can read them. But the point, again, what you want to understand is that United States Code is not organized chronologically. It's organized by subject area. And that is the codification, because it's going to make it so much easier for you to find relevant statutes. You don't want to have to scan through 115 volumes of statutes at large and look at every single public law, right, to see what's on your subject. You want something organized by subject. And here it is, the force of codification. So let's take a closer look at the U.S. Code. And I'm going to start actually by looking at Lexis, which has, so there are 3 versions of the U.S. Code. There's the U.S. Code Annotated, USCA is the abbreviation, and U.S. Code Service, USCS is the abbreviation. USCS is on Lexis, USCA is on Westlaw. It's kind of like Coke and Pepsi. So looking at the USCS on Lexis, we are looking at our section that we've been talking about, 29 U.S.C. S 1144, called Other Laws, not a very descriptive title of the or name of the section, but that's what it's called. And this is where we have our preemption section. And what I want to highlight for now, we'll be talking about a lot of this other stuff, but for now I want to take a look at the history, because we've been talking about the difference between public laws and the code section. And what we have here in the U.S. Code, and we're looking at Lexis, but we'll see this on Westlaw as well, is basically, Lexis calls it the history. And what the history tells us, not surprisingly, is where our section 1144 came from. And what it's telling us, takes a little bit of close reading, is it's telling us that so here we go. Our section was originally enacted, and I know that because it's the very first public law mentioned. So our section 1144 was originally acted by Public Law 93-406. Can you all see this in the back? Should I make it bigger? Do you need me to make it bigger? I don't see anybody really dying for it. Okay. And what our history is telling me is that happened in 1974. It's telling me the details of where in Public Law 93-406. So it turns out 514. What a surprise. That's what we saw, right? And it's even giving me the statutes at large site. And then what I see is this very important semicolon. Bet you thought you'd hear those words in the same sentence, very important semicolon. But it really is, because what that very important semicolon is telling me is it's saying to me, and this was amended by Public Law, I'm just going to the next one, 97-473, back in 1983. It's giving me the details of where in that public law, along with those section numbers, as where I can find this public law in the statutes at large, with even a pin site. And I see that semicolon, and amended by the next public law, 98-397, back in 1984. Again, the details with the section and the statutes at large site. So I see the semicolon. What does that mean? And amended by, and so excellent, Josh, thanks very much. So and amended by what public law? So what was the next amendment? Speak up, you got it. 99-272, excellent. And it was what year? 1986. And what volume of the statutes at large? 100, excellent. Okay, and so what does the semicolon mean, everybody? I know it's silly, but trust me, if you understand this, it'll make it a whole lot easier as we go forward. So, and amended by, everyone, what public law? 101, come on, everybody. 101-239, thank you for not quite everybody. What year? 1989. Okay, and here's, the section's a little hard to find. And what, and what volume of the statutes at large? Okay, and that semicolon one more time with feeling? Ah, excellent. There we go. And what's the public law number? 10366. Okay, everybody follow the rationale here of the history of Section 1144. So, for really super extra bragging rights, what was the last time this Section 1144 was amended according to Lexis? Say it. 2006 by 109-280. Excellent. Okay, so essentially we now know the history of 1144. It was enacted back in 74 by this public law number, subsequently amended by all these public law numbers, and the last time it got amended by Congress was back in 2006 by Public Law 109-280. So I go through this for a number of reasons, but one of which is hopefully so you understand, because this, I think, really illustrates the other reason why codification, why looking in the U.S. Code is the force. In fact, I think one of you very wisely asked this in the screencast questions. You asked, how do I find the code in its current form, or the statute in its current form? And the answer is the code. As you can see, the code contains all of the changes. Not surprisingly, ERISA was enacted in 1974, and not surprisingly, it got amended a whole lot of times since 1974. It's, you know, what, 40-something years later, if I'm doing the math right? So there's at least a dozen different amendments. And what the code does, so you don't have to look through 100-something volumes of the statutes at large, the code brings all those amendments, makes all the changes for you. So all you need to do to know what the current version of this section is to go to the code. Magic, or the force, if you prefer, which I do. Any questions? This is a really important point to understand what you're looking at when you're looking at codes and statutes generally. Okie dokie. So another way to see this, and actually one of you did ask about this in the screencast, there is a table on the web called, not a great name because it's not easy to remember, it's called the Table 3.2, and it's at the House of Representatives website. So if you wanted to Google this, you could just Google House Table 3 tool, and you would get it. And I'll show you how to get here in a moment, but here is our hero, 93406. And what this is showing us is the first aspect of codification, and that is the transfer from a public law section to a code section. So we see here Public Law 93406, we see Act Section 1, and we see the Statutes at Large page, and then we see the title of the U.S. Code, and we see that it went to 1001. So again, this is reinforcing what I mentioned earlier about how the numbers, section numbers of the public law are totally, totally different than the section numbers where it gets transferred to the U.S. Code. We can also see that some of the sections get transferred to a totally different subject area or title entirely. So Section 111, this subsection here, gets transferred to Title 18, which is Crimes and Criminal Procedures in the U.S. Code. Again, if we scroll all the way down to 514, as we already know, we know that it gets transferred to 29, Section 1144. So now this very useful Table 3 tool, again, if you Google it, it should hopefully bring you here. Once you know it's here, it's actually under this heading Other Tables, which again isn't very useful. I wish it were highlighted more, but here it is. And then you just have to follow, if you have a public law number and you have the section number and you want to know where is this in the code, this Table 3 tool is essentially what I call a translation table. It translates between public law section to code section. So if I know I have 93406 and I know that was in 1974, I just go to the year I know, and then I find my public law number, and that's what we were just looking at. So another aspect of understanding the difference between public laws and the code has to do with the names of the public laws. The name of our hero is 93406, but the text name, of course, is ERISA, Employee Retirement Income Security Act. A lot of times you are going to find that what is referenced is the name of the act. And if you don't want to take my word for it, I'm going to show you a news article from all of a couple of days ago, February 4, 2019, and you can find a whole bunch of these. And this has to do with the Voting Rights Act. And so this is a CNN reporter, so this is popular press, but Supreme Court justices refer to act names as well. And here you can see the CNN reporters referring to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. But the CNN reporter is talking about the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act as it exists today. The Voting Rights Act was passed in the 60s, 1960s. So if you wanted to find out, okay, what on earth is this reporter talking about, how would you find the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in the code, so you could find how it looks today? The way you would start to do that is you would go to something also at the same website. This one's got a little bit better name, the Popular Name Tool. So if you typed in Popular Name Tool House, you should hopefully pull this up with Google. That I'm not as sure of. And since if you already have the popular name, so if we went to V for voting rights, and then scrolling down, and we know we want the Voting Rights Act, and there it is, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's giving us actually really a couple of pieces of useful information. That public law number, 89-110, it's telling me when it was enacted originally in 1965, the Statutes at Large citation, and at long last where I can look up the Voting Rights Act in the code. If I only had the public law number, I could go to our, so that's 89-110, I could go to our Table 3 tool, and if I would just need to know the year, again 1965, and if I only had the public law number, 89-110, I'm sorry, and there's 110. And again, I could get the translation. So if I found out where, from the popular name tool, I found out where the act started, but I still didn't know what Section 5, where Section 5 was. So the Table 3 tool will tell me where to find Section 5. And Section 5 is in Title 52, Section 10304, or 10,304. So again, popular name tool will get me the public law number and where it will appear generally in the U.S. Code. The Table 3 tool will get me exactly where a particular section of a public law number appears in the U.S. Code. And again, important to understand the difference between the section numbers in the public law and the section numbers in the code. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with attorneys. These are people long graduated from law school who come and tell me, oh, I went to the U.S. Code and I'm looking for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but I can't find a volume labeled Voting Rights Act. And that's because the attorney didn't remember from law school, probably, that he or she needs to translate from the section number of the public law to the section number of the U.S. Code. Any questions? Okay, so let's go back to Poll Everywhere and see if we understand this. Oh, I have to go to full screen. Okay, there we go. So if you have the name of an act, for example, the Affordable Care Act, what is the best way to find it in the U.S. Code? Okay, anybody need more time? Ah, there we go. Excellent. Thank you all. Okay, if you have the name of an act, for example, the Affordable Care Act, what is the best way to find its public law number? Anybody need more time? Okay, a little trickier, fair enough. So you want to find the public law number first. And again, you can go to the popular name table. The statutes at large, you probably could find it with a little bit of digging, but it's a whole lot more difficult and will take you a whole lot more time. So while that's technically not totally incorrect, it's certainly not the best way. Best way, again, that popular name table. Any questions? Honestly, I'm showing you the popular name table. There are a lot of acts, and I know a lot of people do this. You could go on Google, but you won't find everything. Usually they'll send you to Wikipedia, which the Wikipedia entries, if you looked up ERISA, is pretty informative. But you're not going to find everything that way. So you do want to know, and Wikipedia is kind of hit or miss about giving you the public law number. Okay, let's go to our next question. Question number 6. Okay, this one is a little more challenging. So I'm asking you to go to the popular name tool, and the link is in the statutes module in Lexis Classroom. Just under the Poll Everywhere link, you'll see popular name tool as well as the table 3 tool. But I want you to go to the popular name table or tool, and I want you to find the public law number for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we already found the Voting Rights Act of 65. I want you to find the Civil Rights Act of 64. And this one's, as I said, a little more challenging. If you have questions, give me a wave. Anybody need more time? Again, give me a wave. No, everybody good? All right, let's see what we got. Whoa, excellent. Wow, I'm having a good day. This is exciting. Okay, next question. Okay, if the section number you are interested in is section 2 of any particular public law, then it will be numbered section 2 in the U.S. Code. True or false? Anybody need more time? Let's see what we got. Okay. So absolutely, the vast majority has it right. Again, the section numbers of public laws are totally different than what you're going to see in the code. Remember, section 514 in our hero public law 93-406, 514 wound up to be 1144. The section numbers have nothing to do with one another. All that happens is the different subject areas get pulled out of the public law. So Title I employee is going to go into Labor Code, Title 29. Title II of the Public Law Internal Revenue Code is going to go into Title 26, Internal Revenue Code, of the U.S. Code. And again, the section numbers are going to get all changed. So for the couple of people who... Actually, no one did. Oh, got changed, I think. I don't think I was hallucinating. But anyway, doesn't hurt to review. So let's go to our last poll question, and again, a little more challenging, I think. Now I'm asking you to go to the Table 3 tool, and again, the link is in the Statutes module on Lexis Classroom. I give it to you here. You can try Googling it. And then I'm asking you to find the U.S. Code section for this particular section of this particular public law. So you want to go to the Table 3 code, find the public law from 2010, and see what that section is. Again, if you have questions, everybody getting to Table 3 tool okay? Anybody need more time? Give me a wave. Okay. Another minute or so. You good? More time? Okay. Let's see what we got. Wow, you all got it. At least all of those few who answered. Excellent. Okay. Any questions? So again, I know I'm going into incredible detail here and a little bit of repetition, but if you can understand, going back to our sources, where all this stuff came from and where it all goes, and then the details of how it got there, so how the public law gets to the U.S. Code, then you will do a lot better in understanding how we can find and utilize the code. Okay, so the last thing I will do before we take a break is so we talked this whole translating between public law and code section illustrated illustrated how the force gets used in codification with regard to putting statutes in subject arrangements so we can find statutes on subjects we're interested in. Other aspect of the code, of course, and codification is putting the statutes in a place where we can see where we do see in the code the statutes as they exist today, as they are up to date. So now we're going to move to the different versions of the code. We've already taken a quick look at a couple, but I want to take a little bit more, little closer look so you understand the difference. So of course the official place to find the U.S. Code is called the U.S. Code, and it's published by the government. Back on the walkthrough handout on page 13 is where we saw the titles of the United States Code. And in our sources handout, we see United States Code, also USCA, USCS. And I already introduced the two unofficial codes, USCA and USCS. The U.S. Code is indeed official. If you turn to page 14, you will see the latest edition of the U.S. Code. And I'm going to pull that up here on Hein Online. Now you might notice, I hope, now that we are all bibliographically aware, that the latest edition is labeled 2012. You can see the top number there is 2012 edition of the U.S. Code. And that's what I am showing you on page 14. And here's the volume. And I'll start just a bit with you, just for a change of pace. And so the 2012 edition is going around for reasons I cannot explain to you because I don't know them. The U.S. Code is updated. Each edition of the U.S. Code is updated every 6 years, which you can kind of see from this screen. Get out of your way here on Hein. We've got the 2012 edition. The one before that was 2006, 2000, going backwards every 6 years. Now you might say to yourself, I am hoping, 6 years from 2012 is 2018. Why isn't 2018 up there? And the answer to that question is the government's just behind. So how, then hopefully you're also asking yourself, okay, 2012 edition, what happens in the 6 years in the middle? Like what happened between 2006 and 2012? And what happened to 2012 and however far the government has made it up to before the next edition, which should be 2018? And the answer to that is the government puts out, the government as in the government publication office, puts out supplements. So here you see the 2012 edition on Hein Online, and if I scroll past the 2012 edition, you see here is, don't get confused between volume number and title number. If we're interested in 291144, we want to go by title number. So if we scroll down past all the titles, we actually see there's actually a popular name table here too. But we get to the supplements, and that is how the government updates between the 6 year editions so that we find out what laws happen more than once every 6 years. So we can see supplement 1 after 2012 was in 2013. And then supplement 2. So each year a different supplement comes out. And the latest supplement that we have, and that's actually come out, is supplement number 5, which came out in January of 2018. And each supplement covers all of the changes cumulatively. So you only have, if you were to check the U.S. Code, which really there's very little reason to, which I'll explain why in a moment, if we needed to check titles, our Title 29, we would just need to go to this one volume and we would get all the changes to Title 29 from 2013 to January of 2018. And if you turn to page 15, you'll see the front page illustrating Supplement 5, which again is the last one that has been put out. And just so you can see that up close and personal with show and tell, and get your weightlifting in, we will pass around the book. So that's the Government Publishing Office version, the official U.S. Code. So in comes Free Enterprise and figures, you know, we probably need something a little more current than over a year ago, right? So in came West Publishing, in came another company that's now owned by Lexis, and they publish the unofficial, U.S. Code Annotated, USCA, U.S. Code Service, USCS, and they are far more up to date than a year ago, which is one of the answers to the question, why don't we use the U.S. Code and why do we use the USCA and USCS? The only reason I know of to use the U.S. Code and not the more up-to-date versions is if you need to see a statute section in at a prior point of time. Most of the time, you need to know what the law is now. But sometimes, if some transaction happened or some other kind of action happened that a suit arises that you need to know what the law was, say back in 2014, the U.S. Code would be the place to go. Because you could go back to the supplement that covers 2014 and you could see what the law was in 2014. But if you need to know what the law is now, you want to look at a more recent edition than the U.S. Code. Now, as it happens, the U.S. Code does exist online and is updated more recently than the print version, and we will be looking at that either at the end of class today or next time. But understand the differences between the official and the unofficial. Most practicing attorneys, if they need to know what the law is, they're going to an unofficial version. I think it's only you law students who work for journals that like the official edition so much. And as I actually will show you briefly, and then we'll go for a break. So here is one place. Now the GovInfo, this is where you will find the official edition, but it's not really updated. I actually recommend, again, this site should look familiar now. This is the House of Representatives site. This is my preferred site because it is the most up-to-date, and it actually shows you how up-to-date it is. And again, we'll look at that in more detail either later or next time. And then another good site. So there are all these different sites that have the U.S. Code available that are online for free that are more up-to-date. So you can get this very important information without paying Lexis and Westlaw a lot of money. But I will hopefully, after the break, convince you why we do pay Lexis and Westlaw a whole lot of money to use what I call your very best friend, the annotated code. And on that teaser of a note, I will leave it there. We'll go for a break and reconvene back at 5:30. Before we dive into why the annotated code is going to be your very best friend, let's make sure that we can answer the very important question of how to find statutes, right? We've gone over this already, but it's worth reviewing. So of course we've already just talked about if we have the name, like ERISA, we would go to where? But if we only know it's ERISA, where would we go and how would we know where to go in the labor title? If we have the name of an act, popular name table. So think name, popular name table. It's a good way to remember it. Okay, but if we, more likely than not, we're not going to walk in on a research project knowing, oh, I already know the name of the act. We're going to know, I need to see if there's statutes or find statutes on a particular subject area, right? So where's the best place to start our research? Secondary sources. Thank you. See, no trick questions. See all of you smiling at me. You can answer. I'm not going to, like I said, no trick questions. Okay, so as you may remember, for example, on the screen, one of the groups found this wonderful article in Proof of Facts, liability of health maintenance organizations. And Proof of Facts gave us all sorts of background about ERISA and would give us the reference, if we followed through on the footnote, to 29 U.S.C. 1144, at least for the preemption part of the question, and probably 1132 for the making a claim part of the question. And then we could follow up in the U.S. Code annotated or service there. You want to make sure, though, when you're looking at statutes, secondary sources are great. I hopefully have convinced you of that. But a lot of times, because, especially when you don't know all of the terminology in a particular area, secondary sources will direct you maybe just to one part of your issue, but not the other part, because you haven't used the terminology for a part you don't know about yet. So what you want to do in addition to secondary sources is to also just search statutes, just to see if there's anything else out there that you might be missing. So there are a couple different ways you can search statutes. Keyword search is definitely one of them. So you can narrow with a pre-search filter to statutes, or you can just go ahead and search. I'm just going to go ahead and start my search. And again, so we've been using HMO liability. So So I could do a pre-search filter, or I could do a post-search filter, which is what I will do to take a look at statutes. And so going down here, statutes. And the main reason I wanted to do post-search is just so you could get a sense. So we get a lot of different states. Now, statutes is the one area, or one of the areas, where I would actually recommend narrowing by jurisdiction. Remember, we talked a little bit about secondary sources, and especially in law reviews, not narrowing by jurisdiction, because you can get articles about New York law in law reviews that are in Connecticut law journals. We saw an example of that last time. Or you can get general articles or general secondary sources like proof of facts, or we saw a great ALR that isn't jurisdiction specific, so you don't want to miss that by narrowing by jurisdiction. But in statutes, unlike cases or even secondary sources, statutes in another state aren't going to be persuasive for your state. Even federal statutes, if they're not applicable to your state, may or may not be. So you want to be jurisdiction specific. So I am going to take my advice and narrow by jurisdiction. So let's take a look at both federal and New York, because of course that's what applies for our client. And so here's New York. We'll actually be checking this out next time. And interestingly, our keyword search is actually pretty good in this case. It got us again to 1144. You need to be a little skeptical of keyword searching with statutes because statutory language is very specific. Part of the legislative process, whether it's federal or state, the legislators go through and choose their words very carefully. That's why definitions are so important, because you need to know the definitions of the words. So a lot of times, now here's an example where we did come up with good results, but a lot of times, unless you know the right words, you may not the exact right words, you may not come up with the right results. So we got lucky for a variety of reasons, most of which are because we're looking at annotated codes, and annotated codes is more than just the text. But for instance, our section 1144 doesn't really use the word preemption. So if we know, all right, I need to know more about preemption, if I had used the term preemption in my search, I might not have got this. As you can see, 1144, the name is other laws. Basically, it's talking about preempting other laws is why the name. And then Part A, supersedure. I don't even think I could spell that, but yeah. It would take some thinking anyway. It would take a long time, and the only place you actually went into the term preemption, if at all, are in the annotations, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. So this, again, keyword, you want to look at secondary sources, and then you want to do another search. Another search might be a keyword search like I did, or another search might actually be in an index. Again, you can go to index and print. The index is also available online. Actually, if you type in USCA index, you can find it that way. Here on Westlaw, you can also find a lot of, you can find the index here. I'm not a big fan of using indexes online, in truth, but if you're home in your pajamas at 2 a.m., then it's available. But this may be an example where I might want to look in an index, because if I don't know the exact terminology or I'm not finding anything with the terms I'm using, an index might be useful. So I might want to look under preemption and see if it helps me out. So again, you want to make sure, definitely use those secondary sources and get started, but do an additional search, either keyword or index, just to make sure you're not missing a part of the issue. Any questions? All right, at long last, let's talk about annotated codes. So we have the force of helping us with codification, or codification helping us with the force, either way. But the best application of the force is definitely going to be the annotated code. It's definitely going to be your BFF. Why do I keep on saying that? So let's take a look at an annotated version. So the U.S. Code, what we just looked at with all the 6-year edition stuff, that is not annotated. All you're going to do is get the text. The annotated versions are going to be what we talked about, USCA, USCS, which are on Westlaw and Lexis, as well as there is a kind of annotated code on Bloomberg, which we'll take a quick look at. So let's start with the USCA, and they are different. As someone asked, they are different. The annotations are different, and I will point that out as we go along. So the first thing we have is the table of contents. I mentioned to you that I think checking the table of contents is even more important with statutory codes than it is with secondary sources, and it's absolutely critical with secondary sources. Why do I say that? Essentially because a lot of times secondary sources are going to give you a reference to a particular section that may or may not be exactly what you want. Or you may do a keyword search and get to a section that's in the sort of right general subject area, but isn't exactly what you want. If you go to the table of contents, you can see what else, because it's codified, because it's arranged by subject, you can see what other sections are close that are on a similar or same subject. So we might scroll up and say, oh, civil enforcement. That's kind of what, if it occurs to you, that's kind of what I want to do. You definitely want to check the table of contents and see if there are any definition sections. So I might want to go up and just look at the overall subchapter or even the entire chapter. And I can get to it any number of ways on Westlaw. Actually, sometimes going on Westlaw is more difficult because then you have to click through the different parts and subparts. But you essentially just want to review the table of contents to see in your particular area what is relevant. So for instance, there's one part of the definition section. I might have noticed that 1144 was in this administrative and enforcement part, so I might want to look around there, go up or down a part. Sometimes you can make the judgment looking at the part names, so reporting and disclosure, funding, probably not. So you do your best to make a judgment as to what's relevant and what's worth checking. Okay, so there are occasions where you might be in a situation where you really need to use the print. There's still some organizations that have limited budget for online, so you may or may not have a particular annotated code available to you online. So I'm also going to introduce you to the print because it's a good skill to have, at least with regard to using statutes. So let's take a look at page 16. And what we'll see is the U.S. Code annotated, which is essentially what we were just looking at on Westlaw. And here's what it looks like. I'll pass it around in just a moment. And what you'll notice is the stamp on front, June 17, 2018. Libraries, such as ours, basically tell you when a book has been received. That's kind of a good way to guess how old it is, but it's not a perfect way because sometimes we get replacement volumes. So it's possible we get a replacement volume that was published in 2010, we're still going to stamp it the day we receive it, which could be 2018. So you can't tell for sure by looking at this stamp that this book came out in 2018. Now, as it happens, it did, but I'm just warning you not to rely on that 100% of the time. Okay. I will pass this around in just a little while for you to see. Let's turn the page where you will see on page 17 the table of contents. Now here, to me, is an example where actually the print's a little easier to read the table of contents than trying to click your way through finding on Westlaw. In my humble opinion, obviously you don't have to agree, but in the beginning of chapter 18, we can easily scan and see, okay, I know I'm in chapter 8. I'll show you how you know you're in chapter 18 in just a moment. But I see definitions on page 17 and scanning down to see if there's anything else worth checking. And again, the checking a table of contents takes just a few minutes. Continuing on, we've seen reference to fiduciary duties looking on page 18 of the walkthrough handout. So I might want to see if that is of interest. Of course, we've already seen reference to 1132. If I hadn't, I might notice it here looking at the table of contents, and of course we have the reference to 1144. Turning to page 19 on the handout, I included section 1132 again to remind us that there are frequently more than one section that's relevant that we need to pay attention to. There's more than one aspect to our question. We're focusing on the preemption aspect, but there's that overall, how do we sue for our client question. And you'll notice on top I've circled chapter 18. If I were using the books, that's how I would know to go to the beginning of chapter 18 to look at the table of contents, because I would see that it's chapter 18 on the top. So I would just flip back in the books to the beginning of chapter 18 to see the table of contents. And turning to page 20 on the handout, that's where we see the beginning of 1144, which is the section that we got the initial reference. And again, I would see chapter 18 on the top and know to flip back to check the table of contents at the beginning of chapter 18. Okay, so I definitely want to check the table of contents. Another aspect of our code that we've actually really already seen here on Westlaw. I'm just going to go back to our section 1144. So we looked on Lexis at the history in order to tell what public laws enacted and then amended our section 1144. On Westlaw, it's called credits. Don't ask me why they use different names, but you do just need to remember that. It's just at the bottom past the text of the section. So again, just to make sure we all understand, what's the public law that enacted section 1144? I've only said it about 3 dozen times.
93-406.
Thank you, Eli, very much. 93-406. Okay, what is, so 93-406, what section in 93-406? Someone help Eli out. He's done the 514. Excellent, thank you. And in what year? Okay. And this semicolon means, everybody? As amended by. Okay, and what was the last public law that amended this section? Excellent, 109-280. In what year? 2006. Okay. You're all rather quiet. I know it's hot, but you all understand that. Anybody confused? Okay, that's the credits on Westlaw. Absolutely the same thing as the history on Lexis. If you look on our handout to see what it looks like in print, if you go to page 21, actually 21 is the definitions. I don't want to go past that too quickly. So we saw a definition section, 1002 I think the number was. Notice there's also a definition section within our section. You want to pay careful attention to that as well. That's defining terms used in section 1144. So you want to make sure you understand that and see if those terms are relevant for what you need to know about for our client. Okay, so turning to page 22 is what the credits/history look like in print, and they're not called anything. It's just in small type parentheses after the text of the section. And that's pretty much what it's going to look like in the books in any statutory code in the book. So you just have to know what that is. So you all know what our hero is public law, or as it's abbreviated here, Pub-L, or sometimes PL. Different states will have different names, but essentially it will be this parenthetical after the text of the section. Any question about credits, history, parenthetical? Okay, at long last we get to the annotated code features. And the first feature we'll talk about, I'm saving the best for last in truth, but the first feature we'll talk about of annotated code here on Westlaw is called context and analysis. So what Westlaw, or the USCA, because the USCA does the same thing in print, is telling us all the secondary sources that help explain Section 1144. So if you got to 1144, or however you got there through a keyword search, you did our HMO liability search, you said, oh, 1144, and you're reading this and you're saying, oh my goodness, I don't understand a word of what I just read, which is what I would think anyway. I won't say you do, but I certainly would. I would go to context and analysis and see, okay, how can I get some explanation here? So I might take a look at law reviews or an ALR or see what encyclopedias or treatises. I can go to the overview, it doesn't really matter, whatever you prefer, and take a look at these different sources to help me get some explanation. So I would find that great ALR article that we found referenced here. Yeah, I would have to scroll through and read it. It's not really organized in any way that I've figured out, to be honest, but it doesn't take that long to scroll through to see if there's anything of interest. So that's the first aspect of the annotated code that makes it our BFF. Let's take a quick look at what it looks like in the USCA in print. So turning past from 22, page 23, we will be looking at this historical and statutory notes when we talk about legislative history. So let's turn past that to page 24. And page 24 is where we start to get our wonderful annotated code features, in this case, references to secondary sources. We see law review and journal commentaries. You also see an arrow to promulgation of regulations that, if you are looking at in print, that tells us, oh, there are regulations that I'm going to have to check out. We'll talk much more about regulations when we talk about administrative materials, but again, our statutory code is being a BFF because it's cluing us in that we have to worry about this. But back to our secondary sources. So again, you can scan through if you are using the code in the books, and scan through our various references, which are pretty much organized the way they are on Westlaw. You might want to take a look at the cross-references. I frankly don't find those particularly useful because they wind up being on something other than what tends to be the issue, but it's worth a quick check. So again, you see the lists and our titles and titles listed of the various different types of secondary sources that we just talked about. So scanning through pages 25, 26, 27, it's just ALR and treatises and encyclopedias, not necessarily in that order. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the best part. I would never have made a journal, so I always save the best for last. Bad habit, I realize. But the best part of the annotated code is, for my money, by far and away, the notes and decisions. This is why we in the library pay tens of thousands of dollars for these materials, and I am not exaggerating on the dollars part of that. And that is what the notes of decisions does for us, is essentially part of our research, right? The notes of decisions tells us what cases were decided that discuss our section. So, right, we all know we're going to have to do case law research eventually, right? You've been talking about cases for the last 2 or 3 years. So the U.S. Code, the annotated code does it for us in the notes of decisions. And as they maybe still say in late night commercials, frankly, I don't know anymore, but wait, there's more. What the notes of decisions does is it gives us not only just the cases, but it gives us the cases by topic. So there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of cases that talk about 1144. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be reading hundreds of cases, 99% of which are irrelevant. The notes of decisions gives me a list of topics that the cases discuss that discuss 1144. So it's already narrowed the universe of cases for me to what interprets 1144. And here on Westlaw, I just clicked on the Notes of Decision tab up here. I see that list. And what's particularly nice, and if you look on page 28, I see that list in print. What's particularly nice, I think, about doing it online is that it is, in fact, searchable. So, for instance, I could decide, let's see what talks about denial of care. And notice it's good to read because it's giving me a hint. Westlaw is telling me use /p to search for all terms in a note. Put phrases in quotes. So I'm going to take it as word. I'm going to say denial /p care to search a phrase. I don't have any phrases to put in quotes. I might try HMO or Health Maintenance Organization later on. And if I search, what Westlaw is pulling back for me are the different topic hierarchies that use my terms. So it helps sort of hone in for me. Oh, look, there's one on health insurance. That's probably going to be useful. And oh, look, even better, there's health insurance, health maintenance organizations. That's certainly going to be useful. It's not to say I have to check every single one. Maybe I want to look at torts negligence. And don't ask me why there's torts negligence and negligence torts, but I'll look at them both. So this search feature is particularly useful when you have a super long list like we do. A lot of times when you look at notes of decisions, there'll only be a few cases, especially in state statutes. So it won't be as useful, but it's really great to know about. Again, another tool for your toolbox. Okay, so that is, for my money, the main reason annotated codes are our BFF. And again, looking at the annotated code in print here on page 28, what you'll notice is as you scan down, they're assigned numbers. That's essentially the way you would find the listing for those notes of decisions in print. So notice on page 29, it's assigned 201. We also have that number on Westlaw. You could go to it that way. See if I can get back to that. Yeah, so there's 201. There's our health maintenance organizations. So in print, back on page 29 in the handout, again, just scanning that list of topics. I might also notice malpractice torts. Note topic number 250 is interesting. And the way I use those topic numbers, again, is by scanning through in the book. In the top part, you'll see note 99. I didn't highlight it, but on page 31, right under 291144, you see note 199. That's how I find the topic number. We know we want 201, and sure enough, 201 is on page 31 of the handout. And there I see basically short descriptions of different cases that interpret 1144 that have to do with health maintenance organizations. So again, the magic of the annotated code. And turning to page 32 is where I highlighted for you, again, how to use that topic number 201. Probably less necessary on Westlaw because you can just click, but you can click on the topic number as well. So any questions about notes of decisions, at least in the USCA and on Westlaw? Or any other parts of the annotated code on Westlaw? Okay, let's take a quick look at Lexis. And Bloomberg works pretty much the same way, just names have been changed because, you know, Coke and Pepsi, it's kind of the same thing. They're colas, they just, you know, different names and so forth. So here on Lexis, it does look a little bit different. We have our table of contents here. We also, I didn't point out on Westlaw, but you have the hierarchy up here. So this sometimes is a good way to figure out what part of the table of contents you want to look at. So I might want to go straight to chapter 18 here, or straight to these different portions of the table of contents, or I can just click on the whole table of contents and view the full table of contents on Lexis. And again, the same rationale applies as to why I would want to do that, to check out what other sections may be of interest. Lexis, again, just like Westlaw, has secondary sources that help to explain Again, just looks a little bit different. So if we use this go-to menu, before I went to history to look at the history public law notes, now I would go to research references. And again, I could scroll down and take a look and link where a link is available to the various secondary sources on Lexis that help explain 1144. And yes, there are the very best part, the notes of decision, or on Lexis they sometimes call it case notes. Lexis uses both terms. And it jumps us down to, again, the topics. Now these topics are going to be totally, the names of these topics are going to be totally different than the names of the Westlaw topics. It's just like Coke and Pepsi don't share their formulas with one another. They're both colas, but they don't share their formulas. And some people think they taste the same and some people don't. So they're pretty similar, but not identical. And again, you can scroll through and see which topics are of interest. And if you wanted to search the way we search the notes of decisions, it's a little trickier on Lexis. You need to know about this search document feature where I can try the same search. See what we get. Honestly, I find scanning the topics of notes of decisions or case notes to be more useful than the search. The search I'll do if I know that there's a particular phrase that I absolutely have to find. So here you can see the results of our search. Any question about Lexis annotated code features? Again, pretty much same idea. It's still your BFF. It's just the Lexis version of your BFF. Let's take a quick look at Bloomberg. I know a number of you in our first class expressed an interest in getting to know Bloomberg a little better. By the way, in all these services, when you know the citation, 29 U.S.C. 1144, you can type it in the search bar, which is how I got here on Bloomberg. You can see, again, it looks quite a bit different. Bloomberg is not quite as robust as Lexis or Westlaw in terms of an annotated code, so maybe it's only a BF instead of a BFF. I don't know if that analogy really works, but anyway, we do have the table of contents just as we do on both of the other services. There isn't really the secondary sources, which is why I say it's not as robust an annotated code, but Bloomberg does have something called, you do have the note, the history or the credits. On Bloomberg, they call it general info. Actually, it doesn't really give you that. I take that back. Scratch that from the record. We'll talk about general info in a little while. So that's 2 strikes against Bloomberg. Bloomberg doesn't really have the credits, where that just took us. But what Bloomberg does have, which is where I should have gone, is the smart code. That's Bloomberg's version of notes of decision or case notes. And Bloomberg does have very broad topics. So why does that have only one? I must have narrowed it somehow. So let me go back. Oh, because I went to the wrong section. So let's go to the smart code of 1144. So I must have hit the back, so I was in the prior section. So here's 1144. And again, some very broad topics, like employee benefits is really broad. It's not nearly as specific as the notes that we saw on Lexis or Westlaw. But one kind of neat feature about Bloomberg that is a little trickier on Lexis and Westlaw, you can narrow by jurisdiction, which is not a feature in the notes of decision or case notes on Lexis and Westlaw. You'd have to go to a different function called citing references or shepherds, and I'll show you that next time. Okay, but there is a notes of decision. So you do have, as I said, a kind of BF on Bloomberg. Any questions about annotated code and what it can do for you for your research especially with regard to finding cases that interpret your section. Okay, so we're done, right? We can all go cool off somewhere, right? I see some major identification. Sorry, folks. I know, look at poor Priscilla. She looks heartbroken. And oh, I'm afraid you've asked her to get. We have to update, and update. Even online. Now, it's really easy on Lexis and Westlaw, so it probably didn't warrant all that banging, but you have to look and see when your information has been last updated. Now, as I mentioned, these annotated codes, one reason they are our BFF is that they're far more up-to-date than the U.S. Code, which is at least a year old, but you do need to answer the question, how up-to-date is it? And just to make sure. And answering that question is actually really easy, as I said, but you do need to be aware. So on Westlaw, what Westlaw provides for us is it tells us the currentness of Westlaw. Now, this isn't the currentness of 1144. We already learned that when we looked at the credits, and we saw the last time it was updated. It's the currentness of the code on Westlaw. And what Westlaw tells us, it's current through, and it just gives us these public law numbers. So it tells us PL 115. So what does that tell us? This isn't a trick question, but it is a difficult one. Excellent. 115th Congress. We know we're in the 116th. You kind of just want to remember that. So it tells us this is current through probably toward the end of the 115th Congress, because this is a pretty high number. So again, if you understand the public law numbering, you can interpret. And frankly, for me, this is a criticism of Westlaw. Why can't they just give me a date? Because if we take a look at Lexis, we don't have to do any guessing about public law numbers and dates because it tells us the date, 12/2018. So again, that would be for me, if I were answering a question, which do I prefer? I'm not sure I would tell you I prefer Lexis over Westlaw. I like them both for different reasons, but one of the reasons I like Lexis better is it tells me it's current through with a date. I don't have to guess with the public law number. So that's how we update Westlaw, so we know how up-to-date it is. We know how up-to-date Lexis is. And Bloomberg, and this is where I went wrong before, so learn from my mistake. Back here on Bloomberg, this general info is Bloomberg's updating information, and they're actually pretty good about it too. Once you know to click on general info, it tells us it's current through Public Law 115-440, January 2019. And then it gives you an exception. So the answer is yes, Lexis and Westlaw are going to be pretty much as up-to-date as you are going to get most of the time. So maybe I was a little overdramatic in my update, but you do want to be aware all the time, and when we get a chance to look at free versions of the code, I gave you a quick introduction before, but when we go more in depth next week on free versions of the code, there you will see that it's absolutely critical that you think about updating your code, what you're looking at online. And of course, updating. If you do wind up having to use the print is also critical. I don't know how many of you ever had to do this in legal writing or other classes, but when you're using a code or really any resource in print, you always want to make sure to check the pocket part. Now, I'm showing you the example of our Title 29-1144, and it doesn't have a pocket part. Anybody know why? Anybody remember that stamp we looked at in the beginning? I told you you can look at it and kind of guess when we got it, but it can't be totally reliable. If you turn to page 33, you will find out that in this particular instance, you can rely on that stamp because all I did is I checked the copyright page, which is just the other side of the page of the title page, and I saw, oh look, it was published in 2018. So that stamp tells me we got it in June of 2018. That stamp, if you want to look back, is on page 16. So we got the book in June of 2018. It's now February of 2019. We're probably not going to get a pocket part until another year, which will be June of 2019. So there just is no pocket part yet. And that's going to sometimes happen when you have a new volume. The publishers update the volumes now and again. So for example, this volume is probably due to be updated soon because the pocket part is getting so thick it barely fits. So here's an example, actually, what a pocket part will look like. I know you hopefully have seen them before. And next time when we look at New York statutes, we'll actually take a look at the text of what a print pocket part will look like so you know how to tell what changes look like. Any questions about updating the print? Any questions about anything else other than can we turn on the air conditioning? Okay. So if that is the case, I am going to hand out a workshop. This hopefully is fairly straightforward. And if it is 6 o'clock, the other thing I will do is open the doors and see if we can prop them open and make it a little more survivable in here. So I covered a whole lot of different things. So if you have any questions about how to get to this stuff, how to use any of this stuff with regard to the workshop,